Sorry, he's here. Whoops, recording in progress. Steve is here virtually. He's our moderator. Our panelists are here. And Steve, thank you for coming. And let's go ahead and begin.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I wish I could have been there in person, but health issues kind of caused me to do this virtually. I won't get into gory details, but good morning and welcome to this presentation, which is titled Local Government Techniques and Incentives for Encouraging Affordable Housing. Now, as most of you know in the audience, we all know that housing is a major issue facing our state at all levels at this point in time. What some of you may not know is that there are some local governments that are actively taking steps to encourage the construction of affordable housing and increasing local housing supply. And so this presentation is going to highlight some techniques and incentives that communities are using to meet that housing challenge. So my name is Steve Butler. I'm the Planning and Policy Manager here at MRSC, and I will be kicking off this presentation. And so I'll be doing that by kind of providing a quick overview of techniques and incentives, and then we have some great panelists, which I'll be describing in a moment. So you'll be hearing from the cities of Everett, Spokane, Tacoma, and then somebody will be representing what are called the Arch Cities. And we're hoping to leave just enough time for question and answer. So it's going to be tight, but we think we can do it. So the presenters, already described myself, are Jacques, who's the 2025 Strategic Manager for the City of Tacoma, Spencer Gardner, who's the Director of Planning Services for the City of Spokane, Jennifer Gregerson, who is Special Projects Manager for the City of Everett, and Mike Stanger, who is Senior Planner with Arch. So just a quick overview. There's several categories or types of techniques and incentives the local governments can use: regulatory, financial, procedural, and others. So again, quick overview. Here are some of the regulatory incentives and techniques that local governments can use and have used: density bonuses, inclusionary zoning, reduced parking requirements, and design standards. On the financial side, this slide just shows some of the techniques that are being used. You'll hear more about that from some of the panelists today. And the procedural, permit streamlining. Now, I want to caution the audience that permit streamlining doesn't mean speeding things up and cutting corners and not meeting local standards. It's instead really focusing on steps that can be taken to make the process as clear and as easy to use for both on the development side as well as on the plan review side in the city or county or town. And again, that's a lot of different techniques that are being used, and you'll hear about some of them today. And then, of course, collaboration, partnerships, important. You all know that, but again, housing authorities, nonprofit developers, religious institutions, and others. And then in sort of the other category, there always has to be sort of an other or miscellaneous category. And that includes the use of surplus public land, pre-approved building plans, and other techniques that we'll touch upon today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Spencer Gardner, who will talk about what's happening in Spokane, our host city. So Spencer, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I think it's important, at least we feel it's important here in the city of Spokane, to really differentiate between what we call affordable housing and what we call attainable housing. The first part of my presentation is not dealing directly with affordable housing as such, but more what we like to call attainable housing. So that's meeting the needs of middle-class residents that are being priced out currently, but not necessarily needing any kind of government subsidy for housing. Let's see, does this clicker work? All right, Steve, go ahead to the next slide.
Okay, just a moment. There we go.
So the first thing I wanted to mention is a recent change here in the city of Spokane. I'm just going to talk about this briefly. Some of you may have heard about it. We, a couple of months ago, passed an interim zoning ordinance. Steve, you can go to the next slide. So the interim zoning ordinance, and I'll share a few details in a moment, is where a moratorium is like a brake pedal. The interim zoning ordinance is sort of like a gas pedal. We upzoned the entire city. So we have allowed now in the city of Spokane on any residential lot, townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. That was a change that was made in July. It was proposed the last week of June. So it happened very quickly. And part of our messaging around that was that this interim ordinance is a form of public engagement around housing issues. We've had conversations around housing for several years now, and there was a lot of frustration that we were talking but not doing anything. We felt that the interim ordinance would be a way for us to take immediate action, recognizing that in order to make permanent changes, there's a lot of process, and for good reason, we're generally careful about making those changes, but that this was enough of a crisis that we had to move immediately. So I have on the screen here sort of a sketch timeline. The interim ordinance under state law can last for 1 year. So we have a 1-year clock set for us to make the kind of permanent changes that we want to make to address our housing needs. And again, we're talking here about attainable housing. We're not talking about government subsidies, but recognizing that there's also a role to play for the market to provide more housing for people and hopefully reduce the crunch for the school teachers, firefighters, those among us who have a decent income but are just priced out because of the demand here in our market. Thanks, Steve. So this image is just to give you an idea of some of what we've now allowed in our single family zones outright. And again, that applies for a 1-year period. During that 1-year period, we'll then be making those permanent changes. Next slide. Why don't you just cruise through the next maybe 3 slides. This is a lot of details about the program, and I don't want to waste a lot of time on it. Essentially, we modified some of our dimensional standards to not only did we allow different housing types, but we're hearing from the development community that we had a lot of standards that were really challenging, especially in the sort of the leftover infill lots that hadn't been developed because they were difficult to develop. So by introducing some additional flexibility, we're hoping that we can increase the viability of housing on those types of properties. Another couple of slides, Steve. We included some design standards out of concern for neighborhoods, wanting to make sure that those the houses that are built are compatible with those neighborhoods, that people are that they don't feel like they're out of place. And so those are some aspects of the ordinance that we included in there. Go ahead to the next slide. And the one after that. So that was our interim ordinance. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later. But this is sort of the meat of our economic development strategy. So in August of this year, our city council adopted a change to our approach to economic development, and it was focused around housing. So we designated what we call the Spokane Targeted Investment Area, and this includes distressed census tracts across our city. That's 34 census tracts. It's a pretty large portion of the city, but it represents census tracts that have high levels of poverty or high unemployment or low incomes. And we wanted our programs to really be focused on making investments in those neighborhoods to try to lift them up. We also tied it to the federal new market tax credit designation. So as that changes, as those census tracts hopefully improve, they may be taken off of that new market tax credit designation, and then they will be taken out of the target investment area. Go ahead to the next slide. That's just a map that shows where in our city is covered by the targeted investment area, and you can go to the next one. This is just an example to show, this is near downtown, kind of shows some of the statistics that we're dealing with. The poverty rate, 47%, almost 50% poverty rate in this tract is very high, but not completely out of the ordinary for some of these tracts that are just really challenged here in the city of Spokane. Go ahead to the next slide. So one of the incentives that we created along with this program, or that we sort of revived because it had been on the books previously, was what we call projects of citywide significance. And it is designed so that we can take money as it's available from whatever pot is available and put it towards whatever need we've identified during the period that this is in effect. And so currently this was funded with ARPA money, and with housing being the main concern here in the city of Spokane, this is targeted at housing. So the program applies to the creation of new multifamily units. So that's 4 or more units. It can apply for renters or for owner occupancy. And there is a requirement that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the units have to be set aside for as affordable or for low to moderate income households. And that number depends on the total number of units. So at smaller numbers of units, we require a smaller set aside because we didn't want to kill smaller projects. We will be reporting those details out as the program continues. And those, you do have to pull your construction permits before 2023. Go ahead to the next slide. So what the program does is it reimburses you for essentially for construction permit fees. So if you're building a large multifamily project and your permit fees are above $100,000, which is not unusual for a really large project, the city will offset that cost by up to $150,000. And again, that pot of funding was set up through ARPA, and that money would then go to reimburse the city departments that are running through all the permits and things. So the city is made whole essentially, but the developer is credited for the creation of new affordable units by not having to pay that amount of construction fees. It's available until funds are exhausted. We've already almost run through our total amount of funds. So I would say it's been very successful. And the program was also deliberately designed to overlap with our multifamily tax exemption program. So go ahead to the next slide. I think that's where the MFTE starts. So I think you all know MFTE, multifamily tax exemption. It's a state program, state authorized program. And our city has enacted it. We've had it on the books for a while. But one of the other things that we did as we updated our economic development incentives was rethinking where we wanted to apply the program and how we wanted to apply it in different areas. So first, some details in our targeted investment area. Again, that's the area you saw outlined in red, the distress census tracts. We have 3 different levels of MFTE. The first is an 8-year MFTE that requires, all of these would require to be multifamily, so 4 units or more. And at the 8-year level, there's no income or rent restriction. We made that decision deliberately because we recognize that in a lot of these distressed tracts, they don't suffer necessarily from a lack of housing that is below market rates, but that they actually suffer from a lack of investment. And we didn't want to be discouraging that investment by placing a lot of requirements around it. One of the things that we'll keep a close eye on is concerns about whether that might invite too much investment and you end up with displacement pressures. So we will be watching that and keeping an eye on any issues that seem to crop up. But so far, at least in the city of Spokane, we have not seen the level of displacement or pressures due to investment in a single neighborhood that I think other communities have dealt with. Our housing issues and our price issues seem to be market-wide. So it's not that there's one neighborhood that's necessarily the focus of all of that investment and that there's not those displacement impacts. So we will be keeping an eye on that. The second level is the 12-year. That's a 12-year tax exemption. And in exchange, you have to provide between 1/4 and 1/3 of those units as income or rent restricted. And then the third, which was the third level, which was recently approved by the state legislature, is a 20-year exemption. And that's, again, a 20-year tax exemption. And the units have to be deed restricted, so they remain affordable for life. Go ahead to the next slide. So the other big change that we made is we had our former investment area, or the area where MFTE applied, was a very small part of the city. And it was we felt that it was often subject to politics, I guess, council members or whoever sort of drawing the lines because they didn't like one property or because they wanted another property to be included or whatever. It just felt somewhat arbitrary. And so again, we adopted our target investment area, but we also wanted to encourage housing outside of the target investment area because we recognize that housing is a citywide need. It's not just a need in specific locations. So we introduced MFTE outside of our target area. And if you remember the red map, this is outside of those areas. So these are census tracts that do not meet those standards for poverty rates or income. And in those areas, we allow our MFTE program as well, but we removed the 8-year option. So you only have the 12-year or the 20-year option. In other words, if you're investing in one of our neighborhoods that is not economically distressed, you are going to be, and you want to apply for our tax exemption program, you will be providing some affordable component as a part of that by nature. Go ahead to the next slide. Last, just a quick note about some work that we're doing currently is focusing on repurposing parking and vacant land for housing. We'd rather house people and not cars, hence the name of the program. And what we're looking at is allowing for a lower water and sewer rate for projects that build on top of parking or vacant lots that build residential units on top of those. We've actually heard from our developer community that this could be a really powerful incentive. The rates that they pay on a monthly basis for commercial or for water and sewer can actually be pretty hefty. And so by applying a commercial rate instead of a residential rate, they're able to save quite a bit on their monthly bill. Our water and sewer system ends up not really being any worse off because we're already providing service to these empty lots. They're just not doing anything for the city. And that the monthly savings can really impact their ability to get the kind of financing they need to build projects. So that's something that we are still working out, but I wanted to share some of those details with you. I think that's my last slide, Steve. Yeah. So that's it, and we'll turn it over to Jennifer Gregerson.
All right. Well, cool. I'm happy to be here, and also have to confess that I'm just a few months into my time in this new position at the city of Everett. About 10 months ago, I was finishing up my term as mayor of our neighboring my hometown, Mukilteo. And although our communities are right next to each other, there was still some culture shock in joining a city where housing affordability is a good thing and a challenge to solve instead of an enemy to beat back. All right, Steve, next slide. As a reminder of how these issues can just get away from the values that are important to those of us engaged in this work, these are a couple images that hit the mailboxes of Everett on the left and Mukilteo on the right. One is a newspaper article about a great new development that's 400 units, 100% affordable, being built next to a future light rail station in Everett, using low-income housing tax credits, MFTE, and hopefully another infrastructure grant that we at the city helped them apply for in August. The other one is a campaign piece, but it does show real photos of Mukilteo residents who made yard signs and picketed against our housing action plan. Those protesters would say, and they did say, that they earned their way into Mukilteo, and others can do the same. They didn't see it as an issue when their kids were house hunting farther and farther away from families and jobs, and that more housing just brings crime and overcrowded schools. So you can see why I am happy to be in the city of Everett, and I'm excited to share some of the tools that our city is using and some that we're assessing right now. And all of those are to support our mayor in Everett's vision of being fiercely pro-housing. One more piece on, that's fine, go to the next slide, but on that city leadership, it's really key to pulling the community along to messaging the value of investing in housing and reminding the community that a solutions-based focus on the root causes of affordability and homelessness is really important. And it's also key to have a legislative body that shares those same values. So, and we've got some new council members, but I think we have that in Everett right now. So just for context, of course, from our housing action plan, that identified a need for another 23,000 units in our city of, and, it's similar to what the state allocations are, and that's split between, the ones that are closer to market rate and those that are affordable to folks earning less than 50% AMI. Everett has a decent stock of housing that's kind of in that middle range, the 50 to 80% earners, but we have lots of needs for the future and for now too. All right, next slide. A couple stats on the current use of our incentives. So just in the last 5 years or so, we've had 17 MFTE projects. So to us, that means it's working. That's a good amount. Just 6 that used our fee waiver program. So we have our own sewer, water, and stormwater utilities. So the fee waiver applied to all of those, but it was just for limited to nonprofits. So a smaller pool of potential users. It expired at the end of last year. But yeah, so just 6 projects that use that, and hoping to bring that back and renew that that incentive, particularly if we get that infrastructure grant, then we have to do it. So a good impetus for that. All right, I think next slide. Yeah. So we have specific areas, just like you saw with Spokane, where we're targeting some of that. So focusing on our high capacity transit corridors, the stars on there, you can't see all of them, but you get the idea. Those are those light rail stations, and 16-ish, 17-ish years from now, when those will be built and open. All right. Next slide. Sorry. All right does not mean the same thing as next slide. Got it. Targeting is also important to us because we want to make sure we're tackling displacement risk and equity issues. The areas at high risk of displacement are of course, home to high percentages of people of color in our community. And those are neighbors that have been shut out from many other areas of our city over our history. All right, next slide. I think this is a long list of the incentive programs that we're assessing right now. So some we have, like I've mentioned, the MFTE, we have some SEBA exemptions, so expanding them possibly. And we're looking really to just, introduce some new ones or modify the ones that we have to make them work closer. We've got a consultant that's looking at all the economics of that. And I've got a couple slides on a couple of them. We haven't done land banking in the past, but of course that is like top of mind with light rail development. And we have, I think, some time to do that. So we've got a few years, but it's always the money, and cities never have enough money to do all the things that we'd like. So that's, on the list of examining things. The inclusionary zoning, I think our city is supportive of that. The question is if we want to be the leader in the county and kind of face the risk that that might turn away some development, or if there's a concerted effort and we can bring our whole county along with us. I don't know for sure, but that's kind of the push and pull of, when you've got that leadership in the city, does it exist outside of the community or outside of the city as well? Okay, next slide on fee waivers. So I mentioned our fee waiver program already. It expired. It was a 80% discount on those utility fees. I'm sure, I know that it's going to come forward as part of that review process to bring that back. And again, I think it's reasonable to expand that to any developer, not just nonprofits. Probably a good example of introducing something, kind of taking the baby step that politically feels safer before you get to implementing something broader. Okay, next slide. Okay, made it on there, good. So this is my last one. We had a developer approach the city the last few months, and it's kind of an interesting concept. So they're based out of Los Angeles, Post Investment Group. They built all over the US, and they've done some stuff in Washington, but not this concept. So the idea is to purchase the proposal that they gave to the city was to purchase an existing market rate apartment complex, transfer the city back, or the property back to the city so that it becomes property tax exempt, and then lease it back and operate the building. And their split is to guarantee that half of it is affordable to 80% AMI. The property they identified just as kind of what the concept could look like, not to actually buy. is already is market rate and certainly at risk of being turned over in the future. So it's kind of like the MFTE program, but kind of backwards a little bit. It's a little bit like a low-income housing tax credit. They like it better because they say it's more nimble than getting that that grant. So they're working with the state Department of Revenue to see if it works with our tax structures and like the leasehold excise tax, things like that. So we'll see if it goes anywhere, but I thought it fit this topic as another thing we're kind of exploring. And I think the next slide is my closing. So again, yeah, happy to help answer questions later. And that is the view of from our city hall, which is a great place to work. And I will turn it over to Jacques from Tacoma.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Jacques Colon. I'm the strategic manager for the city of Tacoma. My presentation is going to be a little bit different from the others because you're hearing about a lot of particular incentives that are being thrown at the problem, and I think we're all struggling with which of those to use. I'm going to talk more about the process and the technique of how we actually work on affordable housing as cities, and why a coordinated approach as a technique is actually going to unlock some of the outcomes that we're trying to see and often don't based on just the incentives that we're throwing at the problem. So next slide. As you all know, we are talking about this because we are in a crisis. And so talking about doing this work differently and not simply relying on the same tools that we have been relying on and trying to slowly change them to meet the need, it's just not going to cut it anymore. And so being very clear about that from the start in terms of the need and why we need to think about doing these processes differently, really crucial. I just threw up a couple of headlines and a couple of stats about how the scope and scale of the housing crisis really is affecting folks in Tacoma in particular. And as you all know, we're in a really big supply and demand imbalance right now, and the impacts of that are that Tacoma actually is in the top 10 of fastest rising rents and mortgages nationwide, and it has been for the past 5 years or so. So when we talk about regional issues in the Puget Sound and we talk about the state of Washington, Tacoma is feeling a huge part of that brunt because we are close to Seattle, close enough that folks can make housing decisions based on that, but we don't have the job center quite that Seattle does, obviously. So homelessness being the other crisis that we're dealing with in Tacoma, and I know in many other cities. And so in terms of framing and the process, homelessness is a housing problem, right? So we are never going to enforce our way out of homelessness, and we're never going to service our way out of homelessness, even though that's a necessary component of the equation, right? If we do not solve the housing supply issue, we will not get in front of the homelessness issues that we're increasingly seeing. Next slide. So when I say the process and doing things differently, what I'm talking about for us is something that we call the Affordable Housing Action Strategy. And this is a document that takes 27 different tactics that are organized across all different departments in the city and puts them into one strategic document that is owned by our Office of Strategy. So it's not owned by any department, which is a little bit unique because I know in a lot of cities, financing is owned by the housing division, zoning and development is owned by planning and development services, so on and so forth. We really feel strongly that those silos aren't helping anybody, and that if we're actually going to start having better outcomes, we need to start blurring the lines between those different silos. And so we organize those 27 tactics into 4 main objectives: creating more units, preserving more units, helping people stay in their homes, and reducing barriers for people who often experience them. Creating more units of housing is where I'm going to focus the rest of my brief time up here. There are actually 12 tactics that are just in that one objective. So on the next slide, I'll start telling you what we're starting to see as a result of some of those tactics. We're starting to see results is the bottom line of this slide here. There's a lot of numbers here, and all I will say is we are slowly plugging away at raising these numbers, both for unit creation counts as well as how many people we are helping to keep in their home through all of these different assistance programs. Next slide. So When we talk about those different actions, this is a list of some of them. And on this slide, you see displacement was something that we heard as a concern. It's absolutely a huge concern in Tacoma. We've started to try to think about which of these actions are most important to addressing displacement. And you can see those on the right side. The 4 that are highlighted are the incentives that I'm just going to quickly talk through and show you what we're doing in Tacoma around. But you can see here that there's a lot of different things. And when you throw them all together and put people in the room together and start talking about, hey, Public Works, I know you're working on capital offsite investments. What does that mean if we are going to upzone strategically as part of a planning and development action? So I'll just go straight to the next slide, Steve. So for surplus land, this is an asset that we of cities often have that we don't necessarily always use to the highest benefit when it comes to housing. We've actually, our council has changed our surplus land policy now to have 2 priority uses. One is that if the tribe, the Puyallup tribe of Indians, wants that land because it is on their historic land, they have first right of refusal for that land. If they do not want it, then the next highest priority is affordable housing. So any developer that wants to come in and create affordable housing, they will actually be scored higher and be put into a different prioritization category. So we think by doing that, we're going to be leveraging we're already seeing the impacts of this policy. We are leveraging our surplus land to create more housing by doing this. And we just did a recent change that is about to go into effect that also creates an additional category for home ownership. So we have a rental track and then a home ownership track to make sure we're keeping track of that as well. Next slide. You heard from Spokane about their upzoning plan. In Tacoma, we have one as well. We're calling it Home in Tacoma. We decided to go the lengthier route and not do a short-term ordinance that was coupled with community engagement. We just did the whole thing from the start. And we got through phase 1, which was the policy phase. And so the map you see here is the city of Tacoma, and everything that you see in light yellow was formerly single family housing and is now going to be missing middle housing. So duplexes, triplexes, and townhouses in some uses. So a large area of land that's now upzoned for low scale. And then the orange strips that you see along corridors, those were areas that were also formerly single family zone that are going to be mid-scale. So that would be sort of your larger envelopes. We're now moving to phase 2, which is really about the actual zoning standards and updating the code. And then also, tweaking our affordability and anti-displacement actions to make sure that this works for everyone and not just for developers, which is a thing that we commonly hear as a fear from the community. Next slide. We also are building up our capacity and ability to help folks finance different projects and get them over the finish line through our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And we're of course using things like the 0.1% sales tax that we have the ability to use. And the long and short of it is that we have significantly more money this year to use for projects than we have in the past. 7.1 million this year for our spring NOFA compared to what was in the range of 2.5 in the past. So significantly more money there. Next slide. And then another one is streamlining permit review. Of course, we've already heard this today, but developers like it to be fast. Time is money. And for affordable projects, this is one incentive that we can throw at the problem to help make it a little bit smoother for those that are developing affordable housing. We do aim to make it faster. So I heard your concerns earlier, and we do make it faster right now. I think we're at about 25% faster for those projects that go through streamlined permitting. Next slide. So I think that's it for me, and I'll look forward to answering questions after, and I'll pass it to Mike.
Good morning. How are we doing on time? I think I'll do all right. I'm calling this section getting public value because for me, this whole business, this whole topic changed when I came to understand how and why incentive programs work, and that they didn't have to be this mystery game in which the developers own all the facts and figures, and we on the public sector have to negotiate from a position of weakness or guessing by trial and error. Now, when I use the word incentives through this, I'm lumping together both voluntary and mandatory programs. I hope that doesn't cause any confusion. But I mean the benefits that landowners and developers gain by any public action that adds value to their land or to their projects, regardless of whether it's voluntary or mandatory. Either way, we're talking about the trade or exchange that goes on when the city creates this value through the incentives and tries to reclaim some of that or require some affordable housing in exchange. If we on the public side can calculate the private and the public values of those incentives in that equation, then it levels the playing field and it gives us, it empowers us and our jurisdictions to get more value out of the affordable housing and the incentives. Next, Steve. So as a planner for Arch, I've administered these programs in 9 different communities. And let me take a minute to explain what Arch is. Many people mistake Arch for some kind of special government or a consultant or a nonprofit agency. Arch is actually a local government program that's formed through an interlocal agreement. We now have 15 member cities in King County, and it's a voluntary program. So now Arch staff, including me, we're technically City of Bellevue employees, but we provide staff support to all the members to achieve their own local housing objectives. Arch doesn't have a policy of its own or an agenda of its own, but we do try to encourage coordination across our part of the region, particularly through pooling funds that each jurisdiction voluntarily contribute to a trust fund, which can provide affordable housing investments across East King County. Next, please. This is a lot compiled into one table, but it's just meant to give you a glimpse of the scope of incentives that are provided in those 9 communities. I wish I had time to describe them all in detail, and if anybody has particular questions afterwards, I'd be happy to meet with you. But the point is that we have a lot of experience with a great variety of applications of these incentives. Some are voluntary, some mandatory, some are density-based, some floor area ratio, some provide fee waivers, some don't. About half of them provide or offer MFTE. And the affordability levels on the right-hand side are kind of simplified for the purpose of the slide, but even those are more complex because there are a variety of options in them. The benefit of Arch is having standards and standard contracts, covenants, and staff that developers can work with. So when developers come to us, whether they're doing projects in Kirkland or Bothell or Sammamish, they're working with the same staff, the same legal agreements and process and so forth. Next, please. Now, the focus I want to share with you is not so much on the technical aspects of that, but on how we think of that value exchange that I talked about earlier. Quick story, earlier this year, I had a chance at another conference to ask a state legislator a question. This legislator is proposing or promoting a middle housing bill. And because middle housing would upzone single family neighborhoods, I asked how would she feel about a provision that would allow or allow local governments to require affordability in those neighborhoods. In effect, alerting them, those local governments, to do something that they already have the power to do. But she replied that she wouldn't support that because it might discourage middle housing development, that somebody has to pay for the difference in price between market and affordable housing, and that it might raise the price on the market rate homes. So the balance of my presentation is intended to, in part, to explain why that reasoning is faulty. So anytime a local government increases the development capacity of land, either by increasing height limits or density or whatever, the land value goes up, and we can measure that. So for example, if an acre of land market price is $1 million and the zoning allows 25 units an acre, land is worth $40,000 a unit. If the city then doubles the density, then the value of that land has just doubled. And, or another way to look at it, it's like the city has just given them an acre of free land. So we calculate that value, and we estimate as well the value of an 8-year or a 12-year tax exemption. And if cities have started reducing parking minimums, we're also taking that value into account, the savings that they gain from not having to build as much parking. Developers, of course, are clamoring for parking reductions, saying that it will help them make affordable housing more affordable, but we want to make that a guarantee. So there's no reason why we couldn't put that into a contractual agreement. Next, please. Once we have a good handle on the value that the city's creating for the developer or the landowner, or you might say unlocking that value, we can talk about how much the city wants to try and get back in the form of affordable housing. And this is a well-established principle called value capture that's often used in infrastructure funding. Same thing applies to affordable housing. The value of the affordable housing, as you probably know, is a combination of the percentage of units that are set aside for affordability, the gap between the affordable price and the market price, and the length of time that those units will be affordable. And we like to recommend long-term affordability, but we don't want the affordability to eat up all of the private value that we've created. So we try to set that affordability value or the public value somewhat lower. So there's some incentives, there's something to gain for the landowner as well. Next, please. So this is an oversimplified way of using that information. So if a program is voluntary, then the developer has to be pretty well convinced that they're going to come out ahead in order to take that program. And if it's a mandatory program, then the city has taken that choice away in effect from the developer. And in turn, then the city has the leverage to reclaim more of that value for affordability. Now, developers who don't want to build the additional density or don't like affordable housing can walk away, but at least in our communities where development is already feasible before the upzones, and we have plenty of developers that are willing to do that. So that has not discouraged development. Next, please. This one is just meant to point out that the value that the community is getting from the affordability rests a lot on that rent gap. So if your affordability requirement or incentive requires affordability of 80%, or what did I put here? 80% of median, but your market rents are only 85% of median, then the value is lower than even half as much as if the market rents were 90% median. So it really is important to know what your market rents are doing. Next, please. Now, oops, sorry, lost my place. Another thing, leverage that you gain from this is you can, by layering MFTE on top of an inclusionary program, you can, it has the effect of making the MFTE more compelling. And that allows you to make, to get deeper affordability. So what Kirkland did several years ago was pretty ingenious. They had a voluntary program that incentivized 10% at 80% of median, and they had no takers. And so in 2010, they converted that to a mandatory program. They made the density and height increases as of right, and then required the affordability in return. But they wanted and needed affordability of 50% of median. So they layered on the MFTE, that is, they allowed the MFTE, that 10% set aside to also qualify for MFTE for 8 years. And that additional value allowed them to require 50% of median. They're the only city that is using land incentives that in our region at least, that is getting 50% of median at this time. But Redmond has done something similar. They had they've had inclusionary zoning for about 30 years, and only in the last 5 years did they add MFTE. But again, the same principle with, instead of just a straight land use requirement of 10% at 80, you can get an 8-year tax exemption by lowering that affordability to 60% of median. So next slide shows some results from that. This is kind of an inexact accounting on the gray bars of the market rate development since 2010 when Kirkland created their mandatory program. And as I said, Redmond has had it all along, but only recently added the MFTE program. Now, I think the effect is that people take the MFTE, they get the deeper affordability because it has that mandatory power behind it. People are already setting aside 10%. I mean, so why not get the 8-year exemption and deepen the affordability by 20 points? Now, both cities, Kirkland and Redmond, also offer a 12-year exemption by adding another 10% at 80% of median. But nobody takes that because it's voluntary. And why would they want to encumber another 10% of their units if they don't have to? Now, take a look at Bellevue by comparison, which is committed to voluntary affordability and has less participation in that. So their land use incentives are voluntary as well as the MFTE. Now, this is not to disparage Bellevue because they have money set aside for much more money than other cities do set aside for investments in capital improvements for affordable housing. But on the land use and MFTE side, they've been less productive. And another factor in this is that their MFTE affordability is only 12 years, whereas in Bellevue, Kirkland and Redmond, the affordability remains for the life of the project. So I think I'm probably, if you'd like to go to my last slide, Steve, I'll just try and wrap up. Sorry, I didn't get to show you that. But what I will say about that is we have a tool that can help us with these calculations. Kenmore is changing their voluntary incentives in their transit-oriented district to mandatory with basically tripling their density there, reducing the parking requirement to 0.5 and adding MFTE and with the aim of, I'm a little premature because it hadn't gone to council, but it's at the council's direction, with the aim of getting 25% set aside at 50 AMI, which I think would be tremendous. So the lessons that we've learned, all the evidence that I have gained, is that mandatory programs do create more affordable units and more public value, because they have the effect of compelling deeper affordability if you calibrate it right. Now, if the market, the one caveat I have to give to Kenmore is the market might not be there yet, and you have to be patient to see the results. Kirkland and Redmond went through that as well, but they're getting plenty of production now, and it clearly hasn't softened development. So thanks for listening. Be happy to answer questions here or later.
Right. Thanks, everybody. We actually do have a little bit of time left, about 7 minutes for questions. So one downside of being virtual is I can't see you in the audience. So I'm going to have to rely on the panelists to sort of identify who has their hands raised and they can answer it. So take it away, panel.
Start screeching.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask some of our local housing officials what they think that state capital programs can do to help maximize the impact of these local policies. Is there any sort of innovation or change in the way that state capital programs are administered that seems to be an approach that's been used elsewhere or that might help maximize these policy changes?
We just applied, I mentioned it briefly, for the, I guess, new-ish, the CHIP, Connecting Housing Infrastructure Program. And I don't know if we're going to get it or not. I would say at least the stage at which we applied, I mean, everything is always like, we want to be the last money in and cut the ribbon and be the last piece. And that's great, but you have to have kind of, you got to have somebody provide the early money too. So we just have picked one that was basically, I mean, it's pretty much built. It certainly is construction ready because it's literally under construction. So it's not like it's going to make this project happen or not. So it was a little less flexible, I guess, maybe more flexibility and at an early stage. Any other thoughts? Okay. I feel like there was another hand in this area, but maybe there wasn't, or somebody else. Oh, go ahead.
I just had a question. I think a lot of the presentation was fantastic. Thank you guys. I was taking notes. But a lot of the strategies, since you guys are in more urban areas, didn't really address one of the issues that I have. And I just wanted to see if maybe you had come across this. I'm in central Washington and we have a lot of more rural areas. One of the big issues that we have is that there's plenty of land zoned for housing, available for housing, but we don't have infrastructure going out to it. So it doesn't really make it a desirable place for developers to come in because they're going to have to pay, you know, $3 million for a road, $5 million for utilities, whatever else it may be. Do any of you guys, have you come across that in your areas? I would think you're talking about kind of the available lots and kind of working around infrastructure that already exists, but I wasn't sure if any of you had come across that.
I'll speak to that for a second. So a couple things. I mentioned that the process was really important for us. One of the reasons for that is the funding sources are so diverse and split across different places. So, you know, REIT funding decisions might be made somewhere that are separate from housing decisions. And so making sure public works and housing are talking together could help unlock some resources that might not be there. The other thing is planning strategically for 10 years down the line might allow for some investments that would have been made to be more housing allowable, right? So for us in Tacoma, we've had some transportation infrastructure upgrades long-term with bus rapid transit. And what we've tried to think about is the long-term upzoning of that corridor and what that means for infrastructure in particular, so that we don't have what you said, which is, you know, a situation where it gets built and then you still don't have the infrastructure necessary for the housing. So that strategic planning and then looking for kind of diversifying the funding portfolio to allow for that infrastructure to be built, that's our strategy. But we're obviously not as rural, so I'm sure you have a different level of challenge there.
Do any of your cities use the lodging tax, the state lodging tax, specifically for affordable housing? I know King County has some of those funds apportioned to it, but I'm curious about other cities.
I don't think we do. You guys? Yeah. So it looks like the answer is no. But I should look into it.
Thanks. I have two questions. First, you kind of mentioned developers aren't using the 12-year when they have an option. I'm curious if any of your projects have utilized the 12-year or the new 20-year. My second question briefly is, who's managing these affordable units in these projects? And I know that that's been a big barrier for developers, is they don't know who's going to manage them and how that's going to work, especially if they're permanently affordable. So I'm curious if there's been any discussion about creating public-private partnerships to help manage these units into the future.
That's on my job description to figure it out. So we have kind of like, it's sort of just send in your report, but we don't have a specific person or a program or contract to help manage it. But there's interest in that as the city is growing, and we have more projects that with the MFTE and like the fee waivers and all that other, those other incentive programs. So I feel like one of your cities has like a real thing that's doing it already.
Well, to answer your first question, we've had, I think, a bit of a different experience here in the city of Spokane. Our 12-year program has been very successful up to this point, and we have not really seen a need for mandatory affordable requirements. Our 12-year MFTE has actually generated quite a number of units for us. And I know we allow up to 115% of AMI, but our average, I think our typical unit in the 12-year program is actually closer to 80% of AMI anyway. So we haven't really felt a need to put a lid on that. Obviously, that's something that we're paying attention to. As far as managing the 20-year, we're still sort of in the process of implementing that and answering some of those questions like you mentioned. So I don't know that I have a specific answer other than I think in the proposals that have been discussed so far, it tends to be focused on sharing that management with a nonprofit like Habitat or somebody else who already has that capacity. So we haven't really developed a specific program, but so far it seems to be working out on its own.
So with that, I think we're going to have to end the Q&A period. There's just when things get going that we have to stop. So I would ask the audience to give a big round of applause to all the panelists. Thank you so much, and thanks for attending. Enjoy the rest of the conference.